The Whitmore family's funeral parlor was drowning in an unbearable silence. The only sounds filling the heavy air were muffled sobs and the rustling of dark clothing. In the center of the dimly lit room lay a mahogany coffin, adorned with gold details and surrounded by bouquets of white lilies. Inside, wrapped in a delicate lace dress, rested Eleanor Whitmore, a young woman of only 27, whose sudden death still felt unreal to those present. Her face was serene, yet her pale skin starkly contrasted with the auburn hair that had been carefully arranged by her sister Marigold. Among the mourners stood her parents, Sterling and Blythe Whitmore, figures of rigid composure, their grief evident only in the emptiness of their stares. Beside them, Eleanor's older brother, Thorne, kept his fists clenched tightly, as though restraining something within himself. Marigold, the most openly emotional of the family, held a white handkerchief against her trembling lips, her amber eyes brimming with tears. Eleanor's fiancé, Cashin Monroe, stood motionless, his gaze locked onto the lifeless body of the woman he was supposed to marry in just 2 months. Then, something completely unexpected happened. A hushed murmur of shock rippled through the room as movement near the entrance caught everyone's attention. Slowly, emerging from the dimly lit hallway, a lynx padded forward with graceful steps across the polished wooden floor. Its golden fur, dappled with dark spots, glowed under the soft, flickering light of the chandeliers. Its deep, piercing eyes swept across the room, disregarding the humans entirely. It had only one purpose. The lynx halted before the coffin. For a moment, it hesitated, as if pondering what to do. But then, with an elegant and silent leap, it landed inside the casket, curling up on top of Eleanor's body. The impact sent a fresh wave of tension through the room. No one moved. No one dared to interrupt the eerie, almost sacred moment unfolding before them. The lynx pressed its nose against the woman's neck and let out a low, mournful sound, something between a sigh and a whimper. "Oh my God," Marigold whispered, bringing a trembling hand to her mouth. Sterling stepped forward, his expression hardening in both confusion and anger. "Get that animal out of here," he ordered, but no one moved. Something was deeply wrong. The lynx wasn't just mourning. It seemed to know something that no one else did. And then, everything changed. The collective breath of the mourners froze as Eleanor breathed. Her still chest, lifeless for 2 days, rose and fell ever so slightly beneath the weight of the lynx. Her eyes opened, and what happened next, no one would ever forget. Eleanor came back from the dead. But how? The lynx knew something no one else did. What happens next? Leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. A wave of gasps filled the room. Marigold stumbled backward, her hands clutching at her chest as if trying to steady her racing heart. Cashin's knees nearly buckled, his face draining of color. Even Sterling, who had always prided himself on his unshakable demeanor, stood frozen in place, his lips slightly parted in disbelief. Eleanor's eyelids fluttered, her irises, a shade of deep green once full of life, now dull and unfocused. The lynx remained still, pressing its body against hers, its golden eyes flickering between her face and the horrified crowd. Blythe was the first to break through the paralysis. She was dead, she stammered, shaking her head violently, as if the movement alone would undo what she had just witnessed. "We buried her. This isn't possible." Her voice cracked, and for the first time, the cold and distant matriarch of the Whitmore family sounded truly terrified. The room pulsed with tension, an unnatural stillness gripping everyone as if the very air had thickened, trapping them in an impossible reality. Then Eleanor moved, not a grand, unnatural jolt, but a slow, trembling shift, her fingers curling slightly against the white lace of her dress. Her lips parted, and a ragged breath escaped, shallow but undeniably real. The lynx let out a low, guttural sound, almost like a growl, but not of aggression. It was something else, something ancient, primal, as if it had been waiting for this moment. Marigold stepped forward, her knees shaking. "Eleanor." Her voice was barely above a whisper, fragile and desperate. She reached out, hesitant, as if afraid that touching her sister would reveal some cruel trick of the light. But just as her fingertips brushed Eleanor's cold hand, the woman in the coffin sucked in a sharp, shuddering breath. Her entire body convulsed for a split second before her back arched off the satin lining. A choked sound, something between a gasp and a sob, tore through her throat. The room erupted into chaos. Sterling lunged forward. "Get the doctor! Now!" he bellowed, his voice no longer steady but frantic. Several guests bolted for the door, their footsteps echoing against the wooden floors. Cashin hesitated, torn between terror and overwhelming hope. His bride, his Eleanor, was moving, breathing, but something was wrong. This was not the woman he had held in his arms mere days ago, lifeless and cold. This was something else entirely. The lynx let out another deep, vibrating sound, lowering its head until its nose brushed against Eleanor's cheek. Her green eyes flickered toward it, recognition flashing for just a moment before her body suddenly went still again. The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor was breathing, but she wasn't waking up, and somehow the lynx knew why. The tension in the room was suffocating. Eleanor's chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths, but her eyes remained unfocused, staring blankly at the ceiling. The once mourners, now frozen in a mixture of awe and horror, stood motionless, waiting for something, anything, to make sense of what they were witnessing. The air smelled of candle wax and freshly cut lilies, yet an unshakable chill crept through the space, as if death itself refused to release its grip. Cashin was the first to move. He pushed past the others and fell to his knees beside the coffin, his hands hovering over Eleanor's face, unsure if he should touch her. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice breaking under the weight of fear and longing. "Can you hear me?" But there was no response, just the quiet rasp of her breath, fragile as a thread about to snap. The lynx suddenly tensed, its golden eyes narrowing. A low growl rumbled in its chest, a warning. It lifted its head and stared directly at Cashin before shifting its gaze to the rest of the room. The message was clear: stay back. The animal's presence, once strange but seemingly gentle, now carried something darker, protective, territorial, as if whatever force had brought Eleanor back was not meant to be disturbed. Sterling, ever the man of logic, stepped forward, his patience thinning. "This is madness," he muttered, gripping the edge of the coffin. She was gone. For 2 days, she was gone. He turned sharply to the family physician, Dr. Auguste Leclerc, who had arrived moments earlier, his face ghostly pale. "Well, say something, man. What is happening?" Dr. Leclerc hesitated, sweat beading along his brow. He had treated Eleanor since childhood, had been the one to confirm her death only days ago. But now, faced with her breathing, her faintly twitching fingers, he had no words. I don't know," he admitted. "This isn't possible." His hands trembled as he reached into his medical bag, but the lynx let out another deep growl, making him freeze in place. Then, for the first time, Eleanor moved with intent. Her lips parted, and a single fragile word escaped, so soft, so broken, that it barely reached their ears. "Run." A shudder rippled through the room. Eleanor's voice, frail, almost inhuman, sent a cold dread crawling down everyone's spine. Cashin's breath hitched, his hand tightening around the edge of the coffin. "Run," he echoed, barely above a whisper. His mind refused to accept what he had just heard. She was dead. She wasn't supposed to speak, let alone warn them. Marigold took a trembling step forward, her entire body shaking. "Eleanor," she pleaded. "What do you mean? Run from what?" But her sister remained motionless, her lips slightly parted, her breath uneven. She looked like a porcelain doll, fragile, unmoving, except for the slow rise and fall of her chest. The lynx, still curled over her, released a sharp, guttural sound, its ears flattening against its head. Then, Eleanor's body convulsed. It was sudden, violent, her back arched, her fingers clawing at the fabric of her gown. A strained, wheezing gasp escaped her lips, as if she were choking on something unseen. The lynx let out a piercing snarl and lunged forward, pressing its massive paws against her shoulders. At first, it looked like an attack, but then they realized it was holding her down. "Get that animal off her!" Sterling roared, rushing toward the coffin. But before he could intervene, Eleanor's eyes snapped open, completely black. Collective gasp erupted. The warm green of her irises was gone, swallowed by an abyss of endless darkness. And then she screamed. It wasn't a sound of pain or fear. It was raw, otherworldly. An ear-splitting wail that sent a bolt of terror through every soul in the room. The candles flickered violently, their flames bending unnaturally as if caught in a storm. The air turned icy, suffocating. Cassian stumbled backward, his mind screaming for him to run, but his body refusing to move. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Eleanor collapsed back against the satin lining, her breathing shallow once more. The lynx slowly lifted its head, its golden eyes locking onto the mourners, as if it knew something they didn't. And in that moment, the thought finally took root in Cassian's mind. A thought so unthinkable, so horrifying, that he didn't dare say it aloud. The Eleanor they had buried was not the Eleanor that had come back. The silence that followed was suffocating. Every person in the room stood frozen, their minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. Eleanor's breath was shallow but steady, her hands limp at her sides. The blackness in her eyes had vanished, replaced once again by their familiar deep green. But something was wrong, terribly wrong. Cassian's fingers trembled as he reached for her, hesitating just inches from her skin. "Eleanor," he murmured, his voice unsteady. "Can you hear me?" Slowly, almost mechanically, her head turned toward him. Her gaze locked onto his, and for a brief moment, something flickered in her expression. Recognition? Confusion? Fear? Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I don't know who you are." A cold shock spread through Cassian's veins. He recoiled as if she had struck him. What do you mean?" He searched her face desperately, looking for the warmth, the love, the familiarity that had once been there. But there was nothing. Only a distant emptiness, like a house stripped of everything that made it a home. The lynx, still perched beside her, let out a low, warning growl. Its fur bristled, its muscles tense as if it were preparing to attack. The sound sent a ripple of unease through the room. Marigold clutched the fabric of her dress, her breath coming in rapid gasps. "That's not Eleanor," she whispered. "Something's wrong. That's not her." Sterling clenched his jaw, his rational mind battling the sheer impossibility of the situation. "This is absurd," he snapped. "She's been through trauma. She's disoriented. We need to get a doctor." "No," the word cut through the air, and for the first time, Eleanor's voice had strength. It was firm, unwavering. Her eyes flicked toward her father, and a strange, chilling smile curled at the edges of her lips. "You don't need a doctor," she said, tilting her head slightly, her voice almost amused. "You need to start listening, because I was dead, and something else came back with me. What just happened? Do you think Eleanor is still herself, or is something else controlling her? Drop your theories in the comments. I need to know what you think." The room felt impossibly small, as if the very walls were pressing inward, suffocating those inside. Eleanor's words lingered in the air, wrapping around them like invisible chains. "Something else came back with me." The sentence echoed in Cassian's mind, a slow, creeping terror clawing its way up his spine. His breath hitched as he stared at her, at it. He wanted so badly to believe this was still the woman he loved, the woman he had planned to marry. But every instinct in his body screamed otherwise. Marigold let out a strangled sob, clutching the edge of the coffin for support. Her knuckles turned white, her entire body trembling. No, this isn't right," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're Eleanor. You're my sister. You have to be." But as she forced herself to meet Eleanor's gaze, she realized something that made her blood run cold. The person inside that body was looking back at her like a stranger. like someone or something that had only just learned how to wear Eleanor's face. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, the motion unnatural, too calculated, as if she were mimicking a gesture rather than moving of her own free will. "I remember pieces," she murmured, her voice detached, distant. A cold place, a voice whispering in the dark. Her fingers twitched against the lace of her dress, as if testing the sensation of touch. But it wasn't my voice. It wasn't. Her expression flickered, something shifting just beneath the surface, something almost imperceptible. Then suddenly her gaze snapped to the lynx. The animal had not moved. Its golden eyes locked onto her, unblinking. It was watching, waiting. Sterling, who had spent his entire life dismissing things that could not be explained, finally lost his patience. He stepped forward, his voice sharp, commanding. "Enough of this nonsense," he snapped. "She needs medical attention. She has been through a traumatic event. Dr. Leclerc." But before he could finish, Eleanor laughed. It started as a soft, breathy chuckle, barely more than a whisper. Then it grew, low and unsteady at first, but rising, stretching into something unnatural, something that did not belong in her throat. The sound slithered through the air like poison, sending chills racing through every person in the room. It wasn't her laughter. It wasn't human. Cashin's stomach twisted as he watched the woman he loved smile in a way she never had before. "Oh, Father," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with something far too knowing, far too ancient. She lifted her gaze to Sterling, her lips curling upward in amusement. Her eyes, those same green eyes he had known since the day she was born, were suddenly filled with something else. Something wrong. "I don't need a doctor." Her voice dropped lower, almost playful. "I need you to understand, I didn't come back alone." And then, before anyone could react, every candle in the room went out at once. The darkness swallowed them whole. The darkness was suffocating, thick like ink spilled across the world, swallowing every shape, every breath, every ounce of warmth. The candles had been extinguished all at once, yet there was no sound of wind, no logical reason for their sudden demise. A shudder passed through the mourners, their breaths sharp and uneven in the silence. And then, from somewhere in that impenetrable void, the whispering began. At first, it was barely audible, like wind slipping through a crack in the walls. Then it grew. Soft, layered voices, overlapping in a discordant symphony. Some words were clear, spoken in English. "Not yours. She is not yours." Others were twisted, ancient, incomprehensible, as though spoken by tongues never meant to be heard by the living. The air turned frigid, heavy with something unseen, something that did not belong in the world of the living, something watching. Cashin swallowed hard, his pulse a frantic drumbeat in his ears. He turned toward where Eleanor had been, where her body should still be resting, but all he felt was emptiness. She was gone. Marigold let out a choked sob somewhere in the dark, her hands fumbling desperately for something solid. Cashin, Sterling, the wooden edge of the coffin, but all she grasped was the icy air. "Eleanor?" she whispered, though she knew, deep in her bones, that the thing they had buried was no longer there. Then, all at once, the candles reignited. The dim glow flickered against the walls, revealing the mourners' pale, stricken faces. The coffin stood exactly where it had been, undisturbed except for one horrifying detail. Eleanor's body was no longer inside it. The white satin lining was imprinted with the shape of where she had lain, the fabric still slightly creased from where her hands had rested against her stomach. But now there was only emptiness. The lynx, still perched on the coffin's edge, remained eerily still, its golden eyes trained toward the far end of the room. Slowly, as if sensing something no one else could, it turned its head toward a shadowed corner. Cashin followed its gaze, his breath caught in his throat. The darkness in that corner was deeper than it should have been, a void untouched by the candlelight. Then, a figure stepped forward. Eleanor, or at least, something that wore her face. Her movements were wrong, too stiff, too measured, like a marionette testing its strings. Her hands flexed unnaturally, as if relearning the sensation of touch. And her eyes, Cashin felt his stomach lurch. They were no longer the warm, deep green he had memorized, the color of the woman he had loved. They were darker now, clouded, empty, as if something ancient had settled behind them, looking out through the hollow shell of her body. Then she smiled, a slow, deliberate stretch of her lips, nothing like the way Eleanor used to smile at him. There was no warmth, no love, only a chilling amusement. And when she finally spoke, her voice was not entirely her own. "You shouldn't have brought me back." The room seemed to shrink, the air thick with a suffocating weight. No one spoke. No one moved. They only stared at her, at the thing that had once been Eleanor but now stood before them, wearing her body like a poorly fitted mask. The way she held herself, the unnatural stillness in her limbs, the vacant look in her once familiar eyes. It was all wrong. This wasn't Eleanor. This was something else. Cashin's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his nails biting into his palms. His mind screamed at him to run, to deny what he was seeing, to cling to logic. But how could he, when every instinct in his body told him the truth? The woman he had loved, the woman he was supposed to marry, had not come back alone. "Eleanor," he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. What happened to you?" She tilted her head slightly, as if considering the question. Then, slowly, deliberately, she took a step forward. The wooden floor creaked beneath her weight, and the sound sent a ripple of dread through the mourners. The lynx, still perched on the coffin, let out a low growl, its ears flattening against its skull. The air in the room seemed to shift, growing colder, heavier, as if the very walls were bracing against her presence. "I remember the dark," she said finally, her voice strange. A perfect imitation of Eleanor's, yet hollow, detached. "I remember the silence, and then I heard them calling, whispering, asking me to open the door." Marigold let out a broken sob, shaking her head violently. "No," she gasped. "No, this isn't right. This isn't her. Eleanor, if you can hear me, fight this. Please." She took a desperate step forward, reaching out. But before she could touch her, Eleanor's hand shot up, gripping Marigold's wrist with unnatural strength. The younger woman let out a sharp cry of pain. Eleanor's fingers, or whatever was controlling them, dug into her skin, her grip like ice, like something that did not belong in this world. Her expression remained eerily blank, but her lips curled into something almost amused. "You still don't understand," she murmured, leaning in closer, her breath chilling against Marigold's skin. "I didn't come back. I was brought back. And now, I am not alone." A sudden gust of wind tore through the room, though no windows had been opened. The candles flickered violently, their flames bending in unnatural directions. And then, from the shadows behind Eleanor, something moved. The air grew thick, suffocating, as though the walls of the funeral parlor had closed in, sealing everyone inside. The flickering candlelight barely held back the darkness, and the temperature dropped so suddenly that breath turned to mist. The shadows behind Eleanor moved, not the way light should shift in a dim room, but unnaturally, as if something inside them were breathing, watching, waiting. The presence that had followed her back from the grave was no longer content to remain unseen. A sharp, pained whimper broke through the silence. Marigold trembled as Eleanor's grip tightened around her wrist, her fingers digging in like iron clamps. Her touch was all wrong. It was too cold, too strong, and worst of all, it was spreading. Dark veins crept up Marigold's arm, tendrils of something unnatural burrowing beneath her skin. "Eleanor, please," she gasped, her voice laced with desperation. But there was no recognition in her sister's face. Only curiosity, like a predator watching its prey struggle before the final blow. Cashin's heart pounded against his ribs. He couldn't just stand there. With a burst of frantic energy, he lunged forward and grabbed Eleanor's arm, trying to pry her away from Marigold. The moment his skin touched hers, a wave of numbing cold surged through him, knocking the breath from his lungs. A voice, low, ancient, Wrong, whispered inside his head, speaking in a language he did not know but somehow understood. She is ours now. His vision blurred, his knees nearly buckled, but he forced himself to hold on. You're hurting her, he rasped, his fingers trembling against Eleanor's ice-cold skin. Let her go. Then, a sudden, guttural snarl shattered the unnatural silence. The lynx, that strange, knowing creature that had never left Eleanor's side, sprang from the coffin in a blur of golden fur and claws. It slammed into Eleanor, forcing her back, severing her grip on Marigold. The younger woman collapsed into Cashin's arms, her body shivering violently as she clutched her bruised wrist. Eleanor, however, did not react with anger. She simply stared at the lynx, and for the first time her expression changed. The cold amusement in her face faltered. Her darkened eyes flickered, not with warmth, not with recognition of those around her, but with something closer to fear. The lynx lowered its head, golden eyes burning into her, its fur bristling like a soldier standing before an ancient enemy. Whatever had come back inside Eleanor's body, it recognized the lynx, and it was afraid. Then the shadows behind her expanded. They stretched across the room like long fingers, curling around the walls, swallowing the candlelight. And from within that abyss, a voice emerged. It was not human. It was not from this world. It did not need volume to be heard. It vibrated through the very air, pressing into their bones, into their minds. You do not belong here. The entire room shook. A howling wind surged from nowhere, scattering petals from the funeral flowers, rattling the windows as though a storm had been unleashed inside the walls. The candles exploded into darkness all at once, and in that moment of blinding void, Eleanor screamed. But it was not the scream of a woman. It was the shriek of something being torn from the wrong side of existence. Eleanor's scream tore through the funeral parlor, a sound so unnatural, so inhuman, that it felt as though the walls themselves were recoiling. It wasn't just a cry of pain. It was something deeper, something primal, as if whatever had burrowed its way into her body was being ripped out against its will. The very foundation beneath them trembled, the windows rattling violently in their frames. The darkness thickened, pressing against them, and for one harrowing moment, it felt as though the entire room was on the edge of collapsing into something else, somewhere it was never meant to go. Cashin held onto Marigold as she gasped for breath, her body still shaking from the unnatural cold that had seeped into her bones. Sterling stood motionless, his hands clenched into fists, his eyes locked onto his daughter, or what was left of her. Blythe sobbed softly in the corner, whispering a prayer under her breath. But none of them moved. None of them could. They were frozen, trapped in the presence of something they could neither fight nor understand. The lynx, however, moved. The creature took slow, deliberate steps toward Eleanor, its golden eyes burning in the flickering candlelight. The shadows writhed violently around her, like tendrils trying to hold on, to keep her. But the lynx let out a deep, vibrating growl, a sound that was not just animal, but something more, something older than any of them could comprehend. It stared at Eleanor, no, at the thing inside her, and whatever was inside her stared back. Then, suddenly, Eleanor's body jerked forward, her back arched at an impossible angle, her mouth gaping open in a silent scream. A horrible, wet choking noise escaped her lips as something black and shapeless began to rise from her throat. It twisted and coiled like smoke, but it was not smoke. It had weight, an unnatural presence that made the room feel heavier with each inch it pulled free. The candles flickered wildly, struggling against the force that filled the air. Eleanor collapsed against the coffin, her body convulsing violently as the thing inside her tore itself out. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The blackness ripped free, shrieking into the air, and the lynx leaped. With an ear-splitting snarl, the lynx lunged into the air, its claws outstretched. The dark presence writhed, trying to escape, but the moment the lynx's body collided with it, everything stopped. The wind, the shaking, the voices in the walls gone. The darkness was simply no more. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. Then Eleanor's body slumped forward, her hands twitching slightly as she sucked in a ragged, gasping breath. Cassian rushed forward, kneeling beside her. "Eleanor!" His voice cracked. He reached for her, but hesitated. Was it really her? Her eyes fluttered open, and for the first time, there was recognition in them. Not emptiness, not hunger, just Eleanor. "Cassian!" she whispered, her voice weak but hers. Tears blurred his vision. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she might slip away again. Around them, the others remained frozen in stunned silence, unable to process what had just happened. Marigold sobbed, covering her mouth with her hands. Sterling and Blythe exchanged a look of guilt, of horror. They had buried their daughter. They had let her go, and something else had taken her place. Cassian turned, searching for the lynx, but it was gone. The animal that had never left Eleanor's side, the creature that had known, that had protected her. It had vanished without a trace. Only a few stray golden hairs remained on the coffin's edge, drifting gently in the candlelight. For a long moment, no one spoke. The weight of everything that had happened pressed down on them like a terrible dream. But Eleanor was alive. She was alive, and whatever had followed her back from the grave was gone. Or at least they hoped it was. If this story gave you chills and you want more dark and mysterious tales, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep bringing you stories that will haunt your nights. Now tell me in the comments, what do you think really happened to Eleanor? Did the evil truly leave, or did it just find a new home? Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next videos. You won't want to be left in the dark.